Welcome to Musical Passions and to a special podcast sponsored by CityMusic Cleveland. And this is going to be a preview of their wonderful new concerts on March 19th and 20th, which is called New Voices. It will feature 4 works by women composers, and with my co-host and my guests, Sophie Bain, the cellist of the quartet that will be performing, and Denise Ondishko, who is the composer of the piece on the program called Cloud Shifts, which we will be discussing at great length and also with musical examples. Lots of interesting things ahead, and as we say on radio, stay tuned.
This is a special series of Musical Passions podcasts on the City Music series this year, the concerts that celebrate women's rights to vote and create. We'll be featuring Elena Ruhr and Amy Beach among the composers today. Also, Jessie Montgomery, the youngest of the composers, will be featuring. And last but certainly not least is Denise Ondishko, who is actually with us right now. Back to Eric Kish.
Okay, I'm back with you, and I'm going to start with Sophie to tell us a little bit about Amy Beach's string quartet. I believe it's her only string quartet, and we've had compositions by Amy Beach before on this series, and what makes this particularly interesting and special for you as a member of the quartet that will be performing it.
Yeah, sure. So it's a string quartet in one long movement. It's about, 12, 14 minutes long, something like that. But there are little sections within it, so it does change in mood and atmosphere throughout. It's a really gorgeous piece. It feels very sort of post-Wagnerian. There's a lot of very late romantic, sort of chromatic, really intertwining, interesting harmonies throughout. Some really gorgeous colors. She clearly knows how to write for strings because she's able to achieve this really beautiful, lush, romantic sound. So even though it's a later 20th century work, I think it was finished in the 1940s or something like that, it definitely has that sort of like late 19th century sort of juicy romanticism about it, which is really gratifying as a string player to be able to dig into.
Okay, according to what I've read about it, she started the piece in about 1921. And was still working on it in the 1940s, but it still took a whole bunch of years before this thing was premiered. What was the holdup on it?
She just wasn't happy, I guess.
All right.
Wasn't
Some people
perfect.
dash off, 20 compositions in 3 months, and others take 25 years to really get it going. But it is a gorgeous piece.
Music of Amy Beach, her only string quartet, the second part of it, as performed there by the Neffe String Quartet, recorded at the University of Ottawa in 2018.
Okay, the next piece that's on the program is a work by another contemporary woman composer, by Alina Ruhr.
The interesting thing to me about this piece is that she's so inspired by ancient music and ancient instruments, but she's very contemporary. So it's sort of a blending of the very new with the very old.
Right. She brings in a whole bunch of sort of almost native music. Isn't the first movement called clay pipe?
Clay flute, yeah.
Clay flute, yeah.
Inspired by an ancient instrument that I think it had 4 notes or something like that.
All right. Well, as long as they're 4 good notes, it's amazing what people can do with them. I mean, there was this guy who was deaf, but he was able to take da 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 and do some wonderful things with it.
Yeah, which are just 2 different tones in the da 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 da.
Exactly. So,
but
Amy,
and then her second movement was inspired by.
Tell us what's interesting from a quartet point of view for you to play this Eleanor Rule piece, and what can you tell us about the composer?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting, very intricate piece. It's quite a challenge to put together because the parts often line up in these really oblique ways. So it takes a lot of rehearsing and a lot of sort of finicky nitpicking over little rhythmic nuances to make sure everything kind of aligns. But the effect at the end should feel very flawless and like super easy and effortless. It's one of these really interesting pieces where you can't tell the amount of work that goes into putting it together when you actually hear the thing because it sounds really beautiful. There are these really gorgeous sort of lyrical melodies sort of woven throughout that wind and meander around each other. And so the challenge and the really interesting thing is watching these be juxtaposed against these much more driving rhythmic figures. There are parts of it that sound almost post-minimal in the adherence to sort of rhythmic intricacy and really focusing in on that sort of sense of pacing and phasing out of different rhythms. But then there's also clearly much more melodic moments as well. So it's these interesting different features. Yeah, each movement is inspired by some other form of music making. Some of them are inspired by non-Western musical styles. Others are inspired by these moments from music history. The second movement, for example, is inspired by the music of Hildegard von Bingen, this great medieval composer. But the way that she uses it is that she kind of takes this inspiration of Hildegard's music as being really meandering and beautiful and resonant because it's meant to be played in these beautiful big cathedrals and really resonant spaces. But then she takes that and does her completely own twist on it. And so she comes up with something that doesn't sound like Hildegard at all. It sounds quite contemporary and really interesting in new ways. So.
Well, this sounds very exciting. You mentioned early that it's a tough piece. It's not supposed to sound as though you're working at it, and that is always the mark of the really great musicians, to kind of hide
make it look easy.
Goes into it, right? So we're really looking forward to it. And as a foretaste of what's coming, here is a recording that I found on YouTube of the first movement, which, as you say, is very rhythmically exciting. And I think whoever is tuning into this podcast will be very surprised that modern music based on ancient ideas can sound as fantastic as it does.
From the third string quartet of Elena Ruhr, the first movement, Clay Flute, as performed by the Cypress String Quartet.
Okay, and now it's time to welcome Dee Dee, who is our composer in residence, and this special composition, Cloud Shifts, was actually commissioned by CityMusic, and what you're going to hear on March 19th is in fact the world premiere. Earlier before the podcast, we had discussed with Dee Dee to play excerpts from it because, as you will soon find out, the piece is based on 4 photographs, and I thought we would have a little foretaste of just the 4 photographs. And she said, no, why give the game away and ruin the excitement of a world premiere? So we've got a very controlled snippet for you. Initially, it's going to be a computer playing from Dee Dee's system. And then we will finish up with something very exciting, and I will let Dee Dee and Sophie tell you about that. So, Dee Dee, the floor is yours. Tell us about some of the work that you've been doing and how this particular commission and the inspiration for the composition came to you.
Thank you, Eric. It's really, really fun for me to be here and to get a chance to talk to the audience. The piece was inspired by my friend Susan Britton, who is the first violinist, who asked me to write this piece, and I was super thrilled to do it. We went to school together in college and then in grad school at the Eastman School, so we've known each other for a long time. And so it was really cool to get a chance to work with her, especially during COVID, because, you know, we've all been sheltering in place, but me, because of this commission, I'm grateful to be able to say, I'm not sheltering in place, I'm an artist in residence. So I've really enjoyed having this
you in person.
chance to have.
We'd love to welcome you in person.
Thank you. I hope to be coming up to Cleveland it's too soon now. COVID's still too rampant, but I will plan to come up in September. I have another premiere for CityMusic. I'm really honored to accept and to write. So this piece, Cloud Shift, was inspired by my friend Susan's summer in Lake Michigan, where she just couldn't stop taking photographs of clouds. And she just fell in love with what the sky was doing and the dance of life in the sky. And she said, let's make that our theme. And I said, absolutely. And I fell in love with her clouds. And she sent me a collection, and I picked 4 of them for my piece. And you'll hear each of them. There's also a few moments of clear blue sky. And there's, I hope, a very exciting section for you. It is for me, of rain. So I think, Eric, I wanted to share what the piece sounded like while I worked on it, between my imagination and what I think it's going to sound like. And I want to share that with you. And then I'm hoping that we've got another track, which Sophie shared, which is, what does it really sound like? Sometimes when you're writing, you have a certain sound in mind, and, you know, I wake up in the morning and I'll hear something and I'll go right away and write it down and take it, see where it's going. It's almost like I'm listening to where it wants to go instead of dictating it to it. But there's sometimes some surprises. Once you actually write the notes out, right? You put the notes on the page. Sometimes when they get into real life, there's a surprise. So fortunately, I've been writing long enough that there are fewer and fewer surprises, but I'm really excited to hear this. This very meditative work. I really respect that audience really are surrendering themselves to me, the composer, when they allow their ears to be accept new music, because not all new music is that comfortable. But what I hope I'm giving my listeners is something meditative and uplifting in the same way that clouds are. So if you like Vaughan Williams, I think you'll like this. And I'm really honored to be a part of the program with the other women composers. And
Well, we're honored to have you. And now we'll play the extracts which Dee Dee has prepared for us.
so the really cool thing about that is that was a little bit of a sandbar. And if you can see, if my screen is up, this sandbar clouds keep having gaps in them, and they just kind of fade out to nothing, and you don't know when they can stop and go. So it's just magic to me how that the live instruments can just melt it away and then burst it back. It's excellent. I'm so excited. Sophie, thank you for getting us that recording.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So what you're
I'm
doing,
thirsty for the whole thing now.
You'll have to wait.
so what we're
Yeah, the
doing
whole
then
thing.
in this little selection is we're mirroring the ripples in the clouds and the gaps with silence, in a sense, between the notes before we move on to the next ripple of cloud. I love the effect. right, let's now move on to our final piece, which is called Strum by a contemporary young black composer, Jessie Montgomery. And it's interesting, when her name came up for this concert, I remember hearing a piece by her a couple of years ago with the full City Music Orchestra. And I thought, wow, is this another piece by her? And then I checked with Urgeny, and she said no. Jessie basically wrote the piece initially for a string quartet and then orchestrated it for a string orchestra. And what we had a couple of years ago was the orchestral version, and now we have the string quartet version. Well, I'm in my course on women's contributions. I have one class on women's composers, and this Strum piece and Dee Dee's pieces are hot on my list to include. So you're going to hear more of this. But Sophie, tell us more about Strum.
Yeah, so Jessie wrote it for her quartet. She's a fabulous violinist and is a member of the Catalyst Quartet based in New York. So she wrote it for basically her and her friends and colleagues to play together. And it really has that feeling about it. Like there's a real sense of camaraderie. And it's also very clear that she wrote it like with her own sort of body and her own playing in mind, because it's really gratifying to play as a string player. She clearly knows these instruments. She clearly checked with everyone to see what would make them sound the best. So it's the kind of music that you feel really good about playing. And it's really fun to put together because it has that sense of sort of collaboration and communication between the four members, which is what you want every time you play chamber music. It's all about communicating with your fellow players and really coming together as friends as much as professional colleagues to share something really meaningful. So it gives you that feeling. It's a really rhythmically driven piece. As you can probably guess from the title, there's a lot of strumming in it and a lot of pizzicato, plucking the strings. So you have some really interesting different textures coming out of that and passing different plucking patterns and strumming patterns between the different instruments. Sometimes it feels like almost like banjo or guitar music, the way that the strumming works, more so than what you would typically see in a violin or a violin family instrument. So yeah, it's just a bunch of fun to put together, that's for sure.
You don't think of a string quartet as strumming like a guitar group. So it's an interesting concept, and the title itself, Strum, really says it all. It's interesting that Jessie Montgomery was active in New York and promoting alternative music and Hispanic music and African origin music, and as well as classical, and sort of bringing them together in her work. So
okay, well, let's listen to it then in its string quartet version as our final little selection of giving you a appetizer for what's coming up on the 19th and 20th.
That was Strum, written by Jesse Montgomery, as performed by the ensemble at the Chamber Music Center of New York.
Okay, well, what I'd like to do is to thank you, ladies, Sophie and Dee Dee, for being willing to come and join us for this podcast and to take time out from your very busy schedule. And it is my hope that by September we are totally in the clear and can welcome you in person. And I'm already looking forward to the next composition by you in next year's programs. So thanks, ladies, and see you on the 19th or wave at you on the 20th.
This has been Musical Passions, a podcast arisen from a radio program long dedicated to presenting performances of the finest artists of this and the last century. Thanks for joining us for this special series of programs presented by City Music Cleveland, highlighting works by women composers in its 2020-2021 special concert season. In these challenging times of pandemic, keep informed about upcoming concerts. Sign up for the mailing list here at citymusiccleveland.org. And remember that more than ever, City Music depends on support of people like you. This is Jim Merling speaking for Eric Kish and myself, thanking you so much for joining us for Musical Passions.